Hello and welcome to the Irish History Podcast. My name is Finn Dwyer and this episode is Irland Redaktion, Nazi propaganda in Ireland in the Second World War. During World War II, Ireland remained neutral throughout the entire conflict. Nevertheless, and I suppose unsurprisingly, both the Allies and the Nazis were keen to influence Ireland given our strategic position in the North Atlantic in close proximity to Britain. Although little known today, the Nazis went as far as establishing a radio station, Irland Redaktion, to try and influence Irish public opinion and even the government. The story of this station, which initially featured German broadcasters speaking exclusively in Irish, is fascinating. In today's podcast, I have a really special guest to tell us the story of Irland Redaktion. A few months ago, the second Irish History Summit took place, and we organised a competition for students where they could submit their R.S.R, basically their research projects. Now, the standard of entrance was incredible, but one stood apart. William Quinlan from St Joseph's College in Borrisoleigh, County Tipperary, whose project was on Irland Redaktion, was incredible. The depth of William's research, as you're about to hear, was really top class, and in this episode, he's going to talk you through why the Nazis set up Irland Redaktion, why they initially only broadcast in Irish, and whether this radio station had an impact. You may also notice something a little different about the title of this episode. It has the number 12 out of 50 at the end of it, and I want to explain this because you'll see it in coming episodes as well, and it gives you a sense of my plans for the year. So the 50 refers to the number of episodes I hope to release in 2022, and 12 refers to the number of shows produced so far. Now, getting 50 episodes out in 1 year is a big ask, but it's one worth aiming for. That said, above all, quality content is what matters most to me. So far, we've gotten off to a great start. As I say, today's podcast is number 12 of 2022. This time last year, there was only 9 shows released. Now, when I say we, I'm not talking about some vast team of researchers. I don't have one. There isn't a huge team behind this podcast. But I am talking about the support I get from patrons of the show, listening in now on the ad-free version on Patreon and Acast+. It's this support, your support, that has allowed me to expand the type of show and record episodes in new locations on topics that would have been beyond me in other years. The last 4 episodes, for example, were recorded in Kerry, Dublin, Wicklow and Tipperary and involved driving about 1,100 kilometres. The support of patrons allows me to head out on the road, not to mention spend the time needed researching, writing and accessing resources. Now, to show my gratitude, I'll be listing 15 special supporters in the show notes each week from now on. You can see the first group of special supporters below this episode. If you're a patron on Acast Plus or Patreon and your name is not there yet, keep an eye out because it will be soon. And if you enjoy the show and you'd like to hear more Irish history content, you can support my work and research on Patreon and Acast Plus. There's links in the show notes below. It's straightforward to sign up and makes a huge difference to me. Now to Irland Redaktion. I started by asking William about the background and why the Nazis established a radio station that targeted Ireland in the Second World War.
They often say, truth is one of the first victims in war, and so propaganda, is always a useful tool. So the Nazis themselves, were always on top of the latest technology for the dissemination of propaganda, and that was, both at home and abroad. And so as part of their efforts, they established over 40 different radio services in as many languages, broadcasting to countries around Europe. And their goal was the dissemination of pro-Nazi propaganda. And one of these stations, Irland Redaktion, which means, translates sort of as the Irish editorial team or editorial office, broadcasts to Ireland. And their job was to design, script and broadcast propaganda for Irish listeners.
So I suppose they would have had a different purpose. Maybe you can imagine if they were broadcasting into Britain, who are directly at war with Germany, but in Ireland they had a bit of a different purpose. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. So Ireland being a neutral country in the war, and Germany and Irland Redaktion was hoping to very much promote this policy of neutrality, because neutrality was beneficial to them as well, particularly in the earlier years of the war. Now, the treaty ports had been handed back to Ireland in 1938, Cove, Bearhaven and Lough Swilly. So the Royal Navy didn't have access to these during the war, and they would have really been a great asset to them for the protection of Atlantic convoys, bringing supplies as far as the United Kingdom. So by keeping and trying to ensure the maintenance of the policy of neutrality in Ireland, they were in fact dealing somewhat of a blow to England as well.
And what I found really fascinating about this is that it actually broadcast in Irish initially first. What was the you'd imagine, I suppose, by the Second World War, the majority of people in Ireland obviously speak English. But why did they choose to broadcast in Irish?
Well, so the thinking behind it was that the Irish-speaking population would be more nationalistic and would be more prone, to supporting Germany over England in the conflict. But we also have to consider the actual people who are working on the Irland Redaktion team. And the first head of the Irland Redaktion team, his name was Dr. Ludwig Mühlhausen, and he himself, was a professor of Celtic studies and had a personal interest in the Irish language. So this Irish-only policy, which would last until 1941 on the radio station, was not without its critics within the German civil service. But ultimately, this was in the wider scheme of things. It was a smaller, a smaller operation, within the larger broadcasting, Nazi broadcasting network. So they were able to do their own thing in relation to Irish broadcasting, and so that was the decision that Mühlhausen took.
And you identify a couple of key figures as being central to it, and Mühlhausen being one of them. Can you just talk us a bit about him, because he's, I suppose, not what maybe we might think of as a German in the early 20th century, given his interest in Ireland?
So Mühlhausen was the chair of Celtic Studies in Berlin University, but emblematic, or as a symbol, typical of that time in Nazi Germany, that post had only become available because the previous professor, Julius Pokorny, had lost the job because he had a Jewish ancestry, and once that was identified, that post became available to him. So Mühlhausen himself, he then got that job as professor of Celtic Studies, even though he had comparatively little academic research published. But what we do know is that this vacancy occurred in 1936, and he'd been a member of the Nazi Party since 1932, so he had the connections necessary to take up this post. So Mühlhausen, obviously he was the first voice heard on Irland Redaktion, so he had studied Irish, and he'd studied Irish in the Blaskets, he'd studied Connacht Irish as well, but his final trip to Ireland in 1937 was when he spent 6 weeks in Chellan, which is a small village in the Donegal Gaeltacht. And we can see from his activity there that just how dedicated to being a Nazi he was. In addition to his to perhaps his interest in Celtic studies, was that he had a picture of Hitler hanging on the wall in the fish cabin where he was staying, and he was going around singing German nationalist songs every morning. But a very interesting thing we find as well is that in the German army compiled a military geography of Ireland, and this was sort of a guidebook in the event that they wanted to invade Ireland, and photos of Chellan, this small Donegal village, end up in this. So we can see just exactly how involved he was. But we see Mühlhausen's role then in Irland Redaktion, and as I said earlier, it was Irish only until 1941. But when that policy was phased out, that was the end of his involvement in the radio station. But it wasn't his. But that didn't mean that he was any less significant. He had other things going on. He was a member of a think tank called the Annanerba, which was involved in sort of racial profiling. And his research was trying to work out, well, where do the Celts fit in terms of superiority in relation to the Aryans? And he was actually grew to the rank equivalent to lieutenant in the SS. And this is after his departure from Irland Redaktion. So he was still very dedicated and very involved in the Nazi cause.
And then maybe a person that people may have heard about more is Adolf Mahr. he's also another figure that you go into. Could you tell people maybe first of all who Adolf Mahr was and then his involvement?
Now, Adolf Mahr, was a very interesting character in that he actually had a very high-ranking civil service post in pre-war Ireland. He was the director of the National Museum, and he had arrived in Ireland in 1926. So you see, but not only was he also took a keen interest in the affairs of the Nazi Party. He was, let's say, the leader of the Nazi Party in Ireland. So the arrivals and departures of German citizens into Ireland, he was kept up to date on all of this. So what we see is, although Mahr is the director of the National Museum, he does end up in Germany at the outbreak of the war. And he had been on the continent, let's say, he had been appointed as a delegate for an international congress, and supposedly stayed on a little bit after for holidays. But we know that there was controversy brewing as well in relation to the fact that, conflict was looming, and we have this keen member of the Nazi Party in a significant role in the civil service. So there was some disquiet brewing in Irish circles as well. So he was part of a very small group of, Nazis in influential and important enough roles in the civil service as well, or German citizens, I suppose I should say. There was one in the ESB and one on the Turf Development Board, and then Colonel Fritz Basse was the head of the Army School of Music. So he was part of a small influential group, and when he got as far as Germany, during the outbreak of the war, he actually found himself in a bit of financial poverty. But then we know by May 1940, he has secured some work as a lecturer. But eventually what we do know is that he secures a job in the Foreign Office. And now there had been a sort of conflict between the control of these radio stations, of this radio network. Was it under the jurisdiction of the Foreign Office or under Goebbels' propaganda ministry? And eventually the Foreign Office did seem to win out in this. So he was able to, enact some influence over Irland Redaktion. And, he wrote a report and was a bit critical of this Irish-only policy. That he thought that, we could really tap into, let's say, the wider Irish community as well by using English broadcasts, in Ireland, but also maybe Irish Americans as well. Now, at this time, we know in the 1936 census, there were over 200,000 Irish speakers in the Gaeltacht. So although, they were definitely a minority, there was still a sizable, let's say, audience there. But Mahr does issue this report, and it is accepted, that the service should move to bilingual broadcasting through the medium of Irish and English. But it's not exactly smooth sailing for him either, because let's say within civil service power struggles, it's another man actually initially gets put in charge of this new bilingual service, but he and his team have little to no experience of Ireland, and there's a question as to whether any of them had ever been in the country. So eventually that team only lasts for 5 months, and then he does get his opportunity to appoint someone of his own to head Irland Redaktion, and he appoints Dr. Hans Hartmann, who he would have known from his days in Ireland. Hartmann had also spent time in Ireland as well, and Hartmann had also been a student of Mühlhausen. And so then after the war, there's actually a debate in the Dáil about whether Adolf Mahr should be allowed back, because he's still technically director of the National Museum, so he would have had a comfortable job, £600 a year, waiting for him, and he technically was still employed. But the government was spared that embarrassment because he didn't actually seek to return.
So Adolf Mahr would really have been responsible for making it more accessible, maybe away from that idea of just focusing on the Irish language.
Yeah. And so then we can see, under Hartmann, the man that he appointed, we see new shows being brought on to help attract English speakers as well.
And in that vein, you talk about Francis Stewart. And he has a specific type of show, I think, that you identify that starts to come in. Yeah. Who is Francis Stewart, actually?
Now, Francis Stewart was was actually an Irishman himself, and that was obviously quite a valuable asset of someone with such a knowledge of the country. Now his family were still residing in Glendalough during the war, so he was out in Germany on his own. But he broadcast in English, and he had a weekly show called Through Irish Eyes, so he considered himself to be a neutral, using let's say German radio to express his opinions. But in reality, there was he did have to fall into line on certain issues. But what's interesting about Irland Redaktion in general is that compared to other, let's say, radio services that were operated by the Nazis at this time, is that there's relatively little anti-Semitism. And this is interesting, but I suppose the people working in Irland Redaktion, they understand, let's say, Irish audiences, and that there's not really an appetite. And so then they realise that actually what's more beneficial would be the use of sort of anti-English propaganda, as opposed to anti-Semitism, which had been quite prevalent. Now there were exceptions in Irland Redaktion, but in general there was less of an anti-Semitism policy.
One thing that really interested me, I suppose, coming from the perspective of Irish history, is that the Nazis had identified, I suppose, Ireland's recent past as it was then, and the War of Independence and the experience of British imperialism and colonialism in Ireland as a potential leverage point, and that features in some of the shows.
Yeah, so Flashback now is the key show where we see, sort of anti-English propaganda being used. Now, all the shows had some element of anti-English propaganda, but this one in particular, the way it was designed, was that the Irland Redaktion team had got copy to a book which had been compiled, let's say in Ireland, but for the United States. But they had access to a copy of this book which listed all the atrocities that the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries had committed in Ireland during the War of Independence. And they understood the great propaganda resource that this was. So the flashback broadcasts, they'd list on the anniversary, this date 21 years ago, this town was ransacked, or this person was shot, or this person was executed. So in general, the vast majority of these broadcasts relate to events from the War of Independence and the revolutionary period. But you do also see other things mentioned as well. So, it would go back and occasionally mention things from 1916 or even 1798. But in general, their aim is to remind people that the British are the enemy here, that they're the ones that, that have ransacked your towns and your villages. So they're, trying to reinforce the point that Britain is the enemy, not Germany.
And do they ever shift away from this idea of just trying to get Ireland to be neutral? Are they trying to foment an idea maybe in Ireland that Ireland should at least maybe the old adage of taking advantage of Ireland's or England's disadvantage or whatever is Ireland's opportunity? Is there any attempt to get Irish people to start taking a position in the war?
Well, what we do see is, and one of the most common phrases you hear was "Cuinnig ver no drocht," to keep your neutrality. So that was really the line that they were drilling home. But this wasn't necessarily without exception either. They were constantly, praising the virtues of this new society in Germany and the future of Europe, and basically saying how Ireland's role was with Germany in the future. And we know even when Mühlhausen was in Donegal, he would constantly be telling the locals how everything would be more efficient if the Germans were in charge of agriculture in Ireland. And we can see from his own personal diary that he commented on seeing waste everywhere. So there was certainly an element of that. But in one of Francis Stuart's broadcasts, in terms of actually active support for Germany, he suggested if conscription be introduced in the north, that nationalist soldiers not protest, but they should enlist and do the training and be armed, and then once they're on the battlefield, to simply mutiny and go over to the German side, which was a bit of a fanciful idea, but it certainly shows, in that respect at least, that they were trying to be proactively, one example of proactively supporting the Germans.
You touched on the politics of Francis Stuart and earlier with Mühlhausen, and you were saying that Stuart do we know much about what he's obviously living in Nazi Germany at this point. One suspects it's hard to be neutral, that he's almost that he proclaims himself as some sort of like almost bystander in history when I suppose we all know that being such a figure is very difficult. Do we know anything about his beliefs?
Well, as it would turn out, Stuart's loyalties wouldn't lie with Britain or with Germany, but he saw, as the great heroes of this struggle to be the Soviet Union, who he saw as being, they were attacked viciously, as he saw it, by the Germans. He saw that they weren't, let's say, from his perspective, attacking civilians in the way, that cities were being bombed, let's say, in Germany and in Britain. So he had a great personal admiration for the Soviet Union, and this would come to a head really when he departed the station. It would be because, when the heat was growing on the Eastern Front, there was more pressure on him to broadcast anti-Soviet propaganda, which he refused to do. So he stood by his commitment to the Soviet Union and left Irland Redaktion at that point.
And what happened to him? That wasn't Nazi Germany wasn't known for its tolerance of dissident voices. What happened to Stuart when he?
He lost the privileges that he had, let's say, as being a member of the Irland Redaktion, and there were all sorts of threats put against him. But in the end, ultimately, there wasn't really anything they could do.
And then, maybe going back to the aims of the station is to keep Ireland neutral. Their broadcasting programmes, but they run into some very basic problems. They can broadcast them from Germany, but sometimes getting people in Ireland to actually be able to listen to them proves to be a problem.
Yeah, so Irland Redaktion would have come into a serious number of problems, to most, I suppose, disastrous for them being the lack of actual radios in Ireland at this time. David O'Donoghue in this book suggests it could have been, let's say, as low as 1 for every 30 households, in some parts of Ireland, in the western parts, where the Gaeltacht are, which was their target audience initially. So as the war progressed, what few radios there were fell silent. It became nearly impossible to acquire batteries for radios. We also know that the reception could be quite poor at times, especially for Irish language broadcasts, that it was thought that they were often very hard to hear as well. But let's say other difficulties that they would have faced external to the fact that there was going to be a relatively low listenership. It's not like today. It wasn't mass media in the sense that we have it today. But their broadcasts would draw diplomatic protests from Ireland on 2 occasions. And one of them was a commentary on the execution of an IRA prisoner. But another one was the 1943 general election. Francis Stewart issues a broadcast condemning Fine Gael. Now, although we had a Fianna Fáil government at the time, they saw this as really, a German radio station interfering in internal Irish affairs. Now, Francis Stewart's criticism was that, Fine Gael wasn't as dedicated to neutrality as Fianna Fáil was. So this was one of the occasions when an official diplomatic protest was lodged, let's say, through the delegation in the diplomatic service in Berlin. Warnock, who was in charge there at the time, against Francis Stewart. And so once that message did get through, that was the end of the anti-Fine Gael broadcasts coming from Berlin.
So they would actually try and follow a line that didn't offend the Irish government, or they were conscious of that, were they?
Well, I suppose, they would have seen themselves, they wouldn't have been openly critical of government policy in the South. And then there was a lot of sort of Plumawson as well. One of those flashback broadcasts, I think, congratulated De Valera on his birthday. So you had an element of that, Fianna Fáil was in charge, Fianna Fáil wanted neutrality. So and their goal was, of course, to support the policy of neutrality. Now, it shows, how perhaps unaware they were, that there was a certain tilt to Irish neutrality in favour of the Allies in various ways. But that was their ultimate goal, supporting neutrality and keeping Ireland out of the war and whatever means they had for that.
And then I suppose, coming towards the end of the story of the station, do we have any idea how many people were listening to us? Did it have an impact? in Ireland, or was it this? Was it just being broadcast out into a void, and people in Germany putting lots of effort into something that no one is listening to?
Well, you see, anecdotal evidence, and in larger that's all we have, will differ. Now, you'll have some people saying that these got great attention, but let's say Tomás de Walderer was one man, a famous lexicographer from the Gaeltacht. He was saying that there really wasn't much interest in him. And you'd have some reports saying that people were more interested in listening to the English broadcaster, Lord Haw, and his propaganda. So what we do know for certain is that the lack of radios was a fundamental flaw in any Nazi attempt to broadcast this propaganda and to severely influence Irish public opinion in a meaningful way.
Then we've talked about a couple of different people, Mühlhausen, Adolf Mahr. You touched on what happened to him after the war, Francis Stewart. Do we know what happened to these people later in life, or...?
Well, what we do know is that unlike, Lord Haw, for example, was executed after the war, he was in the English broadcasting section, that none of the actual people involved in the Irish broadcasting section would be executed. Some were interned after the war. Francis Stewart would eventually return to Ireland, and he would become a member of the R.S.R, which is this artistic society. And when he did become a member, the famous poet Máire McConaughey quit the R.S.R when she heard that Stewart was going to be allowed in. Adolf Mahr never returned to Ireland, and Hans Hartmann, I do believe, did return to Ireland, but the topic was avoided in conversation. It wasn't brought up, in conversation with him since. And even he kept teaching and lecturing after the war, and his students had no idea. And one of his students is the man who narrated the T.J. Carr documentary. Had no idea of this whole aspect of Hartmann's life.
And did any of them ever voice regret, or I suppose it's coming back to that idea of why did they do this? Did they see them, how committed were they to Nazism, I suppose? Well,
I think there's no doubt anyway with how dedicated Mühlhausen was. Hartmann, in his role, was always, keen to defend the fact that he resisted any pressure to broadcast anti-Semitic, propaganda on the Irland Redaktion. And to a large part, there is truth in that there was comparatively little anti-Semitism broadcast. Now, the major exception to this rule was the talks under a pseudonym of William Cadogan. Now, but according to Hartmann, according to people involved, these talks actually came from the English broadcasting section and possibly from William Joyce, Lord Haw himself. And as the war progressed, there was certainly a growing sense that Francis Stewart's opinion anyway, that the Irish broadcasting section was coming more and more under the thumb of the English broadcasting section, in terms of scripts and in terms of influence or something. So it is quite possible from that perspective, that there was a genuine desire to keep anti-Semitism out of the Irland Redaktion. Francis Stewart again, would have considered himself to be a neutral working and just using this as a means for voicing his own opinion. But he did display some regret in the fact, knowing once he kind of realised and saw at the end of the war really just what was really going on. He did express some regret at how close he had let himself become to the Nazi state.
And then, what made you pick this out, or how did you come across it? Because it's quite, I suppose it's not, as I say, it's not the first thing. If you pick up a book on the Second World War, this won't be on the first page.
Well, I was drawn to researching the emergency at first, but I really wasn't sure, what aspect I was going to take on it. I was thinking maybe rationing or the effect on just Irish society. So, and I'd done a lot of work, let's say, in perspective, like I'd gone into, the newspaper archives from the Tipperary Star, which ultimately wasn't directly related to this project, but just in getting a sense, what the emergency was like and the environment of World War II at the time. I thought, it was very eye-opening. But then I bought one book by Claire Willis. I was reading that, and it just mentioned the Irland Redaktion, and that kind of caught my attention because I'd be interested in Irish language issues anyway. So once that had my attention, and then I personally had an interest to find out more about this, and so that's that's where it all began.
Okay. And I'm sure people listening at home are going to wonder: are they going to be hearing from you again? Are you going to do history after school, or what? Do you plan to pursue history?
Well, I think history is very important because you don't really have an understanding of what's going on in the present world. Look at current geopolitical situations without understanding, what happened in the past. Well, I might disappoint you now, but I'm hoping to do law and Irish in college. Okay. But I'll certainly keep an interest in history.
William, thanks a million for your time.
Thank you very much.
It's been great to have you on the show, and you never know, maybe it will be history at some point.
Maybe.
I just want to thank William, his teacher Corrad McCormick, and everyone in St. Joseph's College, Borrisoleigh, for making this podcast possible. Finally, a special thanks to this week's producers and all the supporters of the show. If you want to get on board, check out the links to Patreon and Acast Plus in the show notes below. Until next time, slán.